Working Fans Podcast. Cool.
Yep.
All right, here we go. Coming down 3, 2.
Welcome back for another week of the Working Fans Podcast. This is AJ. I'm the former wrestler. We've got Dave, the ultimate fan, here with us. As we do every week, our producer Joe likes to make us sound good and makes us look way more professional than we actually are. As always, you can find us on Twitter, that's @FansWorking, Facebook, Working Fans Pod. We've got email where you can reach out to us and please contact us to let us know what you think of the podcast and for any ideas that you might have. That's workingfanswrestlingpod@gmail.com. We're on Instagram where you can keep up with us at workingfanswrestling_pod. And then you can now listen to us on all major platforms, including Anchor.fm. We're on Google Podcasts, Spotify, Breaker, Overcast, Pocket Casts, Radio Public, Apple Podcasts, and you can actually check us out on YouTube. Now, it's important when you go onto the Apple Podcasts and YouTube, hit that subscribe button, give us a rating, let us know what you think so you can help us out and we can continue to do what we love and bring you guys in as fans.
Hello, everybody. It's the Patriot, Del Wilkes. And you talk about being patriotic. The patriotic thing you can do is tune into the Working Fans Podcast and tell them the Patriot sent you.
All right, everybody, it's the Working Fans Podcast with the man they call Dave. Today I got a special guest, a guy who started off in the AWA as the Trooper. He's been to WCW, WWE, All Japan, and really anywhere you can think of. He's mostly known as the Patriot. I'm happy as hell to have him on today, though. The Patriot, Del Wilkes, ladies and gentlemen. Del, how are you today?
I'm doing great. How are you?
I'm great, man. I'm great. It's great to have you on. You know, for people who don't know, before you got into pro wrestling, too, you had a pretty good college football career?
I did. I was very fortunate. I've been in Columbia, South Carolina my whole life, born and raised. And when you live in Columbia, South Carolina, you really don't have a choice. But you're a University of South Carolina Gamecock fan. I always dreamed of playing there one day. I went to games as a kid with my grandparents and my dad and my dad's brothers. And so watching the Gamecocks play my whole life, I was fortunate that I had an opportunity to go play college football basically anywhere I wanted to go, but I decided to stay home and play for the Gamecocks and had a very good career there. I capped it off in 1984, my senior year, one of the best teams in school history, the most valuable player on that team, captain of that team, and only one of 4 consensus All-Americans, first-team consensus All-Americans in school history.
That's awesome, man. So you were a great athlete before you got into pro wrestling, which is, if I know my history, is probably one of the reasons why Vern Gagne was probably interested in you, because he had a thing where he liked guys with legit backgrounds. And how was the transition? How did you end up in AWA?
Well, I knew that I was going to get the career in pro wrestling whenever my football days were over. I would have rather had an NFL career, but that didn't happen. I signed with the Buccaneers out of Carolina. And then they traded me to the Falcons in 85. I signed with the Bucs. They traded me to the Falcons in 86, and the Falcons released me prior to the start of the season. So I came back to Columbia, and there was a school here in town that was owned and operated by the fabulous Moolah, Lillian Ellison. So I paid my money and went through the training process there. It was more geared for girls. There'd never been a guy come out of there that had any kind of career. So I got some basic training there, and she ran a show here in Columbia. And she had Water on the show, and Water was working for Vern at the time, and Water had a permanent residence in Charlotte, and he had come home for a few weeks. He left Minneapolis, came home for a few weeks and worked that show, and he saw me, met me, and went back and told Vern about me, and just a few months later, I was on my way to Minneapolis working for Vern in the AWA.
Now, how was it working for Vern?
I enjoyed working for Vern. I like Vern. I'm very appreciative of Vern and Greg. Vern had a reputation that a lot of people did not like. I've always been the kind of person to judge someone based on how they treat me and the way they handle me, and Vern was good to me. He gave me my first big break, my first opportunity. The unfortunate part about it was the AWA, which at one time was maybe one of the greatest territories ever, was no longer that way. It was a dying company. They were fighting hard just to hold on. They had the one good thing they had was the ESPN deal where they were on ESPN from 4 to 5 o'clock, Monday through Friday. But at this point, it was basically just a TV company. Every now and then highlight show somewhere. But for the most part, it was just TV, and that was it. And they were trying to hang on. They were trying to find somebody and come in there and drop a bunch of cash in it that would help make them viable again, but they just never found that investor, and eventually, went belly up and went out of business. But it was a good start for me. It got me on TV for 5 days a week on ESPN.
Yeah, and you, I think, are one of the last ever tag team champs with DJ Peterson.
Yeah, DJ and I were the last big champs there, and I think we had worked the Destruction Crew, Wayne Bloom and Mike Ennis for the belts.
Yes.
And won those belts, but it wasn't long after that the company just wasn't going up as I did, and so it was time to move on.
Yeah, it's funny because I was probably in my teens around this time, early teens, and I saw you next as in the Global Wrestling Federation as the Patriot. And the Global Wrestling Federation, for people who don't know, they had a tremendous amount of talent, like in the early tapings. And I mean, Mick Foley, I think, was in there. I saw as Cactus Jack, and you were I want to say you were the initial GWF heavyweight champion. And as a kid, I recognized that physique and the way you talked. I'm like, oh, wait a minute, I know this guy, But what was that like working for Global at that time? You got to still be on ESPN, which must have been nice.
Yeah, we ended up with the same time spot on ESPN, so that was good. It was fun to be a part of an upstart company. We had hoped that we could compete with WWF, as they were then called, and WCW, but as you mentioned, we had a lot of good young talent there. Myself, Marcus Bagel, who was working as a handsome stranger, John Waltman, who was working as a lightning kid, and mixed with some veteran talent, Bill Eady, Stan Lane, guys like that, Eddie Gilbert, Al Perez. So we really thought we were on to something special, and it was fun, it was exciting, it was new. We were ready to take on the world. And so it was great being a part of it in the early stages.
The next time I saw you was WCW, but you might have been to All Japan already that time. Would that be right?
I was working for Global, and I signed a contract with them. It paid me a weekly guarantee, and then it paid me so much every night I worked. And so it was a neat little deal, but I had gone to Japan to work for Baba. I think it was the late 80s, and I'd gone as the trooper, and it just wasn't a very good tour. It didn't go well for me, and I just wasn't prepared for the style of matches and what they did. So I never thought I would go back. I felt like I'd blown my chance. But they, after I gained more experience and been in the Global Wrestling Federation for a while, I just got better. I was more seasoned. I looked better. I was better in the ring. Baba offered an invitation to me to come back. And I went to Bill Eady and Bonnie Blackstone and Joe Pedicino that were running Global. And I said, guys, I hate to do this, but I need to go. I've got an opportunity to go work for Baba, and I cannot turn this down. And they were very understanding. They were very supportive, and they were behind me 100%. So I left with their blessings, and I went and worked a couple of years for Baba. And then after those couple of years, that's when I ended up in WCW.
You had been there prior once before. It was, being from South Carolina. I met culturally, big difference. Was that some adjustment, or was that something you embraced? How was that?
Being where?
In Japan, just the culture, the food, was it tough for you, or was that something you hear people say sometimes people love it, sometimes it's challenging?
Well, it was definitely different.
Sure.
And at first it was a tough adjustment, but I was lucky that I was sharing the bus with a good group of American wrestlers, and one of them, he and I became quick friends, and actually became best friends, one of the greatest friends I've ever had, in Doug Furnace. So Doug showed me the ropes. Doug could follow me, and I'll show you what to do, what not to do, where to eat, where not to eat. I'll sort of, show you around. And Doug had been going there for several years at that point. So with Doug's help, I adjusted pretty quickly.
That's awesome, man. That's awesome. He was a tremendous athlete, too. I remember the drop kick for a guy who was so jacked up his size that he could hit, too. Outstanding.
I'll tell you this, and I've always said this, and I'll go to my grave saying this. I've been around some great athletes in college football, in the NFL, in pro wrestling. I was fortunate to block for a Heisman Trophy winner in South Carolina, George Rogers. But the greatest athlete I've ever been around was Doug Furnace, by far. Wasn't even close.
Wow.
Phenomenal athlete.
Yeah, it's saying something. Obviously, working AWA early days and then GWF having a good TV deal. Being a wrestler early on in that TV experience must have helped you, I would imagine, when you got to WCW too then.
Oh, yeah, it has helped to be on TV, and you've already been exposed to a nationwide audience, and maybe at that time with ESPN, probably even a worldwide audience, because I think by then they started going globally. And so it helped. I was accustomed to, being on TV, and I ended up in WCW through my friendship with Eric Bischoff and Greg Gagne, because when I was in the AWA, Eric was our TV announcer, and at this time he was running WCW, and Greg Gagne, who I got to know very well and become good friends with in the AWA, was one of the bookers in WCW. They were booking by committee then, and Greg was on that committee, so my relationship with those two guys is what landed me in WCW.
Now, you ended up being tag team champions there with Marcus Bagwell. You obviously worked with him a little bit in Global. How was your relationship with Marcus? How was he to work with?
It was good. I've known Marcus since the GWF days when he was working as a handsome stranger. And when I got to WCW, they were still putting a great emphasis initially when I got there on tag team wrestling, and they had some great tag teams there. They had pretty wonderful Paul Roma and Paul Orndorff. They had the Nasty Boys. They had Harlem Heat and some other tag teams. And so Greg came to me, Greg Gagne, that is, with the idea of putting Bagwell and myself together, and I was good with it. I liked Marcus. Everything about Marcus, he's a pro. He's a pro's pro. He was dedicated to the business. He worked hard in the gym. He made sure he looked good. He worked hard on his craft of being good in the ring and being good on the mic. And so, it was a good fit. We got along well together, and we ended up winning the belts there twice. So initially, my time in WCW was good. Now, it didn't end up that way, but to start with, it was good to be there for about a year, probably.
Oh, if you don't mind talking, I never heard about how you ended leaving WCW. That was actually going to be my next question. I never heard that story.
Well, they ended up, and it was a big coup. They ended up signing Hogan away from Vince.
Yes.
In the WWF, and that's a big deal, a very big deal. At that point in time, the biggest star pro wrestling had ever seen, Hulk Hogan, is coming to work for WCW. And then they brought in other guys. They brought in Savage and Duggan, and they were bringing in a lot of other guys. Beefcake, after they brought Hogan in. Once they got Hogan, the floodgates sort of opened, and a lot of the other WWF guys came in. And I understand you've got the biggest star on the planet in your company. The focus should be on him, and rightfully so. But the focus soon became not just Hogan, but the friends of Hogan. Mm-hmm. If you were in that Hogan clique, then you were in programs that were important. If you were in that Hogan clique, you were used. If you weren't part of that Hogan clique, then you were sort of put on the back burner. And that's what happened to Marcus and I. Listen, that's what happened to Austin. I was...
you took the words right out of my mouth, Dal. I was going to say that after you were done talking. It wasn't just you. I remember that time period as a fan thinking, why has Steve Austin moved down that card? But go ahead.
Yeah, anybody that had one eye could see what a talent Steve was. And I'll never forget it. We would go to Disney. We would go to Disney in Orlando and film our syndicated shows at MGM Studio, or Universal Studios, and we'd go down there every few months and spend about 3 or 4 days just taping stuff and putting it in the can for the syndicated shows. And I'll never forget, we're at the hotel, and Austin came out of the room and he said, dude, you won't believe what just happened. He goes, but I just got fired. He said, basically, Eric told me that there are 1,000 guys like me out there. There's a bunch of blonde-headed guys with black trunks and black boots, and I felt that we were in the same position. So I reached out to Baba. I left on good terms with Baba, and I just put out a feeler and said, hey, look, if I would like to come back, could I? And Baba said, absolutely, we'd love to have you back. So I asked for a meeting with Eric, and I went to Eric, and I said, look, dude, I got about a year and a half. I signed this 3-year deal. I'm about halfway through this contract, and it's obvious you're doing nothing with us. You have no plans for me, no plans for this tag team. It's all become about Hogan and Hogan's buddies. Let me out of my deal. I can go back to Japan. I'll be on the other side of the world. The fans in America will not see me. I'm no threat to you. I've got an opportunity to go back and work there. And I feel like they'll use me and push me and do some stuff with me, and it wouldn't let me out of the deal. Well, I was gone either way. Either he lets me out of my last year and a half, or I'm walking. And I didn't tell him that. Mm-hmm. But when he played hardball with me and he said, no, you're going to finish out your contract, I've called Bob up and said, listen, I'm ready, let's go. So just a few days later, I was on a plane back to Tokyo for the next tour for All Japan. And I called Marcus, and I told Marcus, and I said, I owe it to you to let you know you're my friend, you're my brother, you're my partner. But I'm done. I'm heading back to Tokyo. I'm going back to work for All Japan. And you can tell them you don't know nothing. That you're as confused and, blindsided by this as they are. And I got some threatening letters and some threatening phone calls. But I ignored them. I figured they'll go away if I just ignore them. Baba got a few threatening letters, and I told him the same thing. I said, just ignore them. They'll go away. I don't mean anything to them. And so they eventually went away and left me alone, and I was back in Japan.
Yeah, it makes sense. I mean, at that time, they probably had everything going on. It was almost like they were probably just worried. I guess they must have been worried the thought that anyone was going to WWE at the time might have bothered them. But that's wild, man, because I remember even as a young fan, watching, I think it was a WCW Saturday Night episode. And, I wasn't on the internet or anything back then, but I just remember thought, it was going to be like Randy Savage versus Steve Austin. And I was so excited to see this match because I was a fan of both of them. And I thought I was going to, Savage beat him in a minute. And I'm like, what was that about? It was no story. It was just he came out and beat him in a minute, and that was the end of it. I was like, wow, this makes no sense.
Yeah. To say they mishandled him would be a great understatement.
Yeah, it worked out well for Steve, I guess. So.
Yeah, it did.
So now you end up in WWE, and I was listening to some stuff with Bruce Pritchard before this, and Bruce talked about he was high on you, Jim Ross was high on you, and Jim Cornette were all very high on you. Vince, it wasn't that he wasn't high on you the way he said it, but he wasn't sure about the mask. How did you get to WWE, and what was your, how was it dealing with Vince? What vibe did you get for him?
Well, I'd gone up and worked for Vince in the early 90s, gone out on the road for several weeks. Rick Martel was hurt. They took him off the road, so I went up and worked several weeks with him, and had an opportunity. I could have gone to work for Vince then, but I didn't want to give up my Japan deal. Japan was very important to me throughout my entire career. It's the highlight of my career working there, and so I didn't want to give that up. But here I am now in 97, and JR reached out to me. Jim Cornette reached out to me. Bruce did. And so I went up, and they flew me up, and I met with Vince. And Vince wanted me to work there. He was, he was excited about it. His only hesitancy, the only, thing that he thought was, like you mentioned, he didn't know if a masked character could really get over with the WWF fan base. And I said, Vince, again, I said, it's gotten over everywhere else I've been. I don't know why this fan base would be any different. They're wrestling fans. And so I was convinced I could do well there. And so he saw early on the reception I was getting night after night and at TV the first couple of times, and it was over with the fans. And so that's when he decided that he would pair me up with Brett, and we would do that American-Canadian angle, and we had a lot of fun with it.
Yeah, it seemed like the timing was really good because Brett was such a hot heel at that point, and it was this very strong Canada versus U.S. feeling among the the fans back then. It seemed like it seemed like it was a good time for you to get in that.
It was a great time. Right off the bat, after just a few weeks of being in the company, I'm paired up with the with the guy that's wearing the belt, sort of the face of the company, the top heel in the company, and. Unfortunately for me, it didn't last as long as I hoped or as they hoped. But, before I got there, I was beat up. My body was, I'll never forget when I left that meeting with Vince, and with a 3-year deal in hand, they offered it to me. And I said, well, Vince, I need to go back home and talk with my wife and have my attorney look this over. But I feel good about it. I'll let you know within 48 hours. And he said, okay. And I remember getting home, and I had some major injuries, and I'd already had surgeries, and I was just struggling to stay healthy. And I told my wife, my wife at the time, I said, I think I'm going to do it. I said, but there is no way that I'll be able to fulfill the 3 years on this thing. My body was rapidly failing me, and I had a bad knee that has since been replaced 3 times. I had a tricep that had ripped off the bone and had to be reattached 3 times. So I knew going in I was damaged goods. I just took how long I was going to make it.
Right.
But I knew I was on borrowed time. And unfortunately, it didn't take long, and the injuries just caught up to me.
Now, I want to ask you one thing. I heard you very honest about your career where you talked about you had, like a lot of wrestlers, struggled with pills and stuff at the time. I heard this about other wrestlers like Shawn Michaels, who's very open about it. And Shawn wasn't the easiest guy to be around. He was very honest about. But even like you talking about your like issues with this stuff and past interviews and stuff, I've never heard anybody say anything bad about you. It's always constantly been, Del was a great guy, great to work with, a lot of fun. Was it just more like a situation where your body was so beat up that, that was mostly the issues?
Oh, that was totally 100% the issue. And I think I hid my addiction very well. My addiction didn't start after I got out of the business. It had already started. I was living off pain pills. I'd gotten to the point where at my worst, I was taking 100 to 120 Percocet a day. I would take 15 or 20 at a time. And then you couple in the muscle relaxers, the Xanax, the Halcyon, the sleeping pills. And I was having to do that. I took a couple one night before a match to get through because I had an injury. And just a few short years later, that too turned into 20 at a time. And it just grew out of hand. But no one that I worked with was aware that I was, they knew that I took pills. We all did. Mm-hmm. But none of them was aware that the issue was as bad as what it was. But yeah, I got along with everybody I worked with. I was there to do what I was paid to do and paid a lot of money to do, and tried to be a professional about it. But I think I hid that addiction very well.
Yeah, almost like a blessing and a curse at the same time, right? Like you were able to do your job and you were able to function, but unfortunately nobody could probably see the issues to give you a hand or help you because you were so good probably at, not hiding it, and it didn't, affect your job probably.
Yeah, I would agree with that, and I think that's a good assessment.
Now I want to ask you, excuse me, Dale, a couple of names here that you worked with. Bret Hart, how was he to work with?
I enjoy working with Bret. Bret's, like I said about Bagwell, he's a pro's pro. And working with Bret was very, it felt familiar to me. The very first time I got in the ring with Bret, I think was Pittsburgh, on a Monday Night Raw. And it felt very familiar. And the reason it did, it was Bret worked the way I did, sort of snug, not stiff, but snug. And it just felt like I was working an All-Japan match. It was, Bret was, took his time. He was methodical. He didn't rush things. He could speed it up when he needed to and slow it down when we needed to. So working with Bret was easy. It was a very smooth transition.
One other name I'll ask you too about, two other names. Vader, how was he to work with? I think you teamed up with him a few times and stuff.
I did, and I worked a singles match against him in for Vince as well. I don't know who I was talking to the other day. I was doing a podcast for someone, but I'll tell you what I told them. Vader was in WCW when I was in WCW, and I had a match with Vader one night. And the Vader in WCW was a different Vader in WWF. When I got to WWF, he was no longer the same character. He got a monster push in WCW, and he was the monster that ate everybody up and destroyed everybody. Well, when he got to WWF, they used him differently, and he wasn't that, that monster bad guy heel that just crushed everybody. He had to do a few jobs for some people, and for some people that weren't as big as him, and it bothered his ego. And from a confidence standpoint, he's a great guy. I got along with Leon. We traveled on the road together. We spent a lot of time together. But Leon in WCW was a different Leon in WWF.
Makes a lot of sense. Like, I'm just thinking back as a fan watching it, like the matches he had in WCW, especially like with Mick Foley, he looked, and obviously you probably hear it with Mick too, he was beating the hell out of people sometimes. There was definitely more a physical Vader in WCW, it felt.
Yeah, it was, and he just, himself, he was just in a different place. I don't think he was very happy with where he was at in WWF, but he was being paid big money, and so I think he just sort of rolled with the flow. Now,
one other name I want to ask you as we're recording this, Road Warrior Animal unfortunately passed away yesterday. I just want your thoughts. Have you worked with Road Warriors, Animal and Hawk, and if so, how are they?
Never worked with them in the ring. I traveled with them when we were in the WWF together. I spent a lot of time with those guys on the road, me and Mike and Joe traveling. Good men, good guys. Obviously what they did in the ring speaks for itself. They changed the business in so many ways. But out of the ring, they were good guys. They were down-to-earth guys. They were approachable guys. To people that saw them on TV and saw them in the ring, they were probably scared to death of them, but they were guys that fans could approach, and they were very approachable. And just good men. It's just hard to believe that they're both gone. I had just spoke to Joe last week on his birthday. Oh, wow. And it's just hard to believe that now they're both gone. Way too soon, man. Way too soon.
Absolutely. Yeah, huge fans of them growing up, man. One other thing I wanted to ask you about before, I was going to ask you about this. You have a podcast you're doing right now, too. I want to ask you about that. But, I'll ask you about that first because I'm having a brain fart here. You have something on, I want to say it's on Facebook Live, Unmasking the Truth. How did that come about? What is that about? Tell us about it.
Like most guys in the business, I've done hundreds of podcasts, and I did one about 2 years ago with a guy named Avi Klein, and I was just impressed with Avi. Just in the way he conducted himself. I've never laid eyes on Avi, never met. We talked a few times on the phone just to set up that particular podcast that I did for him. And I don't know, here 4 or 5 months ago, he reached out to me with this idea. And I had other people reach out to me about a podcast. And I just never felt right about it. I never felt good about it. Really, just sort of hesitant to get involved in it. I felt like everybody in the world's got a podcast. Why do I need to do one? But when Avi approached me, and I was determined that I'm more than just a professional wrestler. And I was determined that if I ever did a podcast, that it was going to be not pro wrestling. We talk about pro wrestling. Obviously we do. It's a huge part of my life. I've been associated with that business for over 30 years. But I love sports. I love current events. I love politics. And so, the one thing that Audie and I both agreed on is that this would be a podcast that would occasionally talk about wrestling, but it wasn't going to be wrestling-centered. I wanted it to be centered around other things. So I guess now we've been going for not quite 3 months. We're on Facebook Live, my Facebook page, Del Wilkes, or Avi Klein's Facebook page. Every Sunday night at 8 o'clock. It's called Unmasking the Truth. And, man, it's been great. The response has been unbelievable. It's been more than I ever imagined, and we're growing like crazy. And there are several other guys that are also co-host podcasts with Avi like I do. It's under the umbrella of Wrestling with Anything But podcast. And so I invite folks to listen. This right now with the election right around the corner, a very, very important thing for this country, regardless of what side you come down on, regardless of what candidate you support. This is a big election. It's a big deal. So right now our podcasts are really focused about the election, and we talk about the election for the next few weeks leading up to the election. But we also talk about wrestling. We play fun games, and we have a segment every Sunday where we talk about All Japan Pro Wrestling. We're going to have a segment on Wahoo in a couple of weeks. So we still contribute to wrestling, but it's not just typical or totally wrestling-centered.
That's awesome, man. Actually, you reminded me what I want to talk about was the last question. You seem like a very patriotic guy, which is very ironic. That was your character, but you also seem like a very patriotic guy. How did the Patriot gimmick even come up? How did this happen?
Well, I had nothing to do with it. I'd love to take credit for it, but I can't. When I got the call about Global, and it took a while for Global to materialize and come together. They were having some funding issues initially, but this idea was there for months and months, and it had been brewing. I knew that whenever it happened, if it did happen, they were very, they made it very clear to me they wanted me to be a part of it. So when finally Global was going to happen and we were going to do our first TV taping in Dallas, Texas at the Sportatorium, I flew out with my trooper gear. Nobody had told me different. I fully expected to go out and work as a trooper. And all of the talent stayed at the same hotel. We stayed at a roadway inn there near the Sportatorium. And the day we were going to do our very first taping, literally just a few hours before we left to go to the building, Joe Pedicino called me, and he said, I need you to walk over to my room. He said, Bonnie's in here, and me and Bonnie and Bill need to talk to you about something. So I walk in the room, and Bonnie literally pulls out this paper grocery bag, those brown grocery bags, and she unrolled it, and she reached in and pulled out a red, white, and blue mask, reds, white, and blue tights, reds, white, and blue trunks. And then Bill and Joe laid out the idea to me about the Patriot. And it was based on the fact that at that time, the Persian Gulf War was going on. Our troops had been sent to Kuwait to liberate Kuwait from when Iraq had gone in and invaded and occupied Kuwait. So patriotism was at really a high level. And they said, look, we feel like we can take advantage of where patriotism is right now. And the idea is for this character called the Patriot. Here's what he's going to wear. Here's the gear. And we think you're the guy that can do it. And it changed my career. And that very first night when I walked down the aisle at the Sportatorium, those fans had never seen that character. But when I walked down the aisle, the building erupted. And I knew right away we were on to something good.
Yeah, and I'll say this before we finish up. One thing I definitely liked about you, Del, was, you weren't necessarily like maybe a classic promo, but you could cut up a fired up promo. Like when you started talking about coming to towns and, there's Patriot everywhere in your town, like you could feel it. You got very emotional. You were very good at getting fired up.
Well, I'll tell you, it wasn't just a gimmick for me. It's who I am. I am madly in love with the country I live in. I think it's the greatest country that's ever existed. And it's not a perfect country, but I love it. And if I had to, I'd die for it. My son served 4 years in the military. I never did. But I love this country. And so that wasn't a stretch for me. It was true to my heart. I still love this great nation.
Is there anything else you want to promote besides Unmasking the Truth? Anything else you want to talk about where people can find you?
Well, you can go to my website, DellThePatriotWilkes.com, and Del is DEL, DellThePatriotWilkes.com. And you can buy 8x10s there. You can buy cards. You can also get our DVD, my documentary that came out several years ago, The Man Behind the Mask, or I think that's what it is. I can't remember the name of it. But the documentary can be purchased there. You can buy masks. You can buy T-shirts. You can also buy 8x10 photos, cards, posters, and things of that nature. So it's DellThePatriotWilkes.com.
Awesome. We'll put that out on Twitter when the interview gets released too. So we'll direct.
And also you can through social media on my Facebook page, Del Wilkes, and on Twitter at Del Wilkes, all caps, DELWILKES.
Awesome. Del, thank you so much. This was an absolute pleasure. I get a lot of wrestlers out here. You're a very genuine guy. I can feel that. I really enjoyed talking to you, man. Thank you so much.
Thank you, man. I appreciate it very much.
No problem. All right. Hey, have a great night. Thank you.
You too.